I had exactly 30 seconds before the most important deal of my career either moved forward or stopped completely. And in that moment, the CEO's wife looked me up and down across a candlelit ballroom and asked her husband why the entertainment had been allowed near the investor table. Her name was Vivian Ashcroft. Mine is Miranda Vale. And what she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except me, was that I was the one person whose signature was required to release $500 million. Not the lawyers, not the board, not her husband. Me. Let me take you back to where this really began. 3 months before that gala, I had accepted a position as transaction compliance signatory for Northspire Capital, a mid-sized institutional firm that specialized in infrastructure acquisitions. The role was quiet by design. Most people at the closing table never knew exactly who held final authorization on the escrow release. That was intentional. Compliance signatories operated in the background, reviewing governance disclosures, verifying documentation chains, confirming that everyone whose name appeared in the transaction filings had conducted themselves within the behavioral standards written into the agreement. If something appeared wrong, I had one tool available to me: a temporary administrative hold triggered under what the agreement called the Reputational Governance Clause, Clause 14.2. It had been included in the transaction documents for months. No one had ever expected anyone to use it. The Ashcroft infrastructure expansion had been in negotiation for nearly a year. Daniel Ashcroft had built the company over 2 decades, and starting with regional utility contracts and eventually expanding into large-scale civic infrastructure, bridges, water treatment facilities, public transit corridors. By the time the $500 million deal reached closing, the company had become exactly the kind of asset that institutional investors quietly competed to fund. Pension funds, university endowments, sovereign wealth vehicles, the kind of capital that moves slowly, carefully, and almost never retreats once committed. The closing gala at the Harrington Grand had been Daniel's idea: a formal investor dinner, black tie, the kind of event designed to make $500 million feel like a celebration rather than a transaction. I had been invited in my professional capacity, which meant my name appeared on the guest list as a compliance officer. Oh, what that title meant in practical terms was largely unknown to the social guests who filled the ballroom that evening. To Vivian Ashcroft, who had attended dozens of these events over the years and who treated each one as an extension of her husband's social standing, I was simply an unfamiliar face at a table she considered hers. The string quartet had been playing for about 40 minutes when it happened. I was standing near the investor table, holding a glass of sparkling water, listening to a senior partner from Hauschen Capital discuss projected returns on the infrastructure expansion. The conversation was substantive, the kind of exchange that happens when serious people are close to finalizing something significant. The room smelled faintly of white lilies arranged in tall vases along the perimeter. And beneath that, as the warm cedar scent of the wood-paneled walls. These details stay with you when something sharp interrupts them. Vivian moved through the ballroom the way people do when they have spent a lifetime assuming rooms belong to them. Her gown was deep burgundy, her jewelry understated in the way that only very expensive things can be. She reached the investor table, touched her husband's arm lightly, and then her gaze found me. She tilted her head. A small, slow assessment, the kind that communicates everything without saying anything directly. Then she spoke. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying the effortless lightness of someone who had never once worried about consequences. "Why is she even here?" She swirled the wine in her glass. "I thought tonight was for investors." Her lips curled slightly at the corner. Not entertainment." The words dropped into the conversation like something cold. Two investors nearby stopped mid-sentence. A server who had been moving quietly between tables paused without appearing to. Someone behind Vivian raised a phone. Slowly, casually, the way people do when they want to record something without announcing it. Before I could respond, her son appeared beside her. Troy Ashcroft was in his mid-30s, tall, and carried the particular kind of authority that comes not from earning it, but from never having it questioned. He moved forward with the unhurried confidence of someone who had grown up watching his father's name open every door in the room. He stepped into the space between us, too close, deliberately close, and looked at me the way people look at obstacles rather than people. "Oh, this is a private investor event," he said, his voice carrying a faint sneer. "Not a nightclub." He glanced toward the security staff near the entrance. If she's confused, someone can escort her out. A few people at nearby tables laughed quietly, awkwardly, the kind of laughter that people produce when they're not sure whether to be uncomfortable or amused. Most people in the room did neither. They simply watched. Across the ballroom, Daniel Ashcroft had heard the exchange. I could see him from where I stood. He hadn't moved. He hadn't intervened. He simply stood there, watching his wife and his son, and said nothing. That silence told me more than the insult had. I set my glass down on the table, gently, no argument, no raised voice, no visible reaction at all. Just a quiet decision made in the space of about 3 seconds. And I excused myself from the table and walked calmly toward the hallway outside the gala floor. The hallway was marble and dim, the sound of the quartet muffled behind the closed doors. The scent of white lilies followed faintly through the gap before the door swung shut. I stood alone for a moment, the city visible through the tall windows at the far end of the corridor. Office towers lit against a dark sky, traffic moving silently far below. Then I opened my clutch, took out my phone, and scrolled to a contact I had never needed to use in this capacity before. Dominion Trust Bank, escrow operations. The call connected after 2 rings. Escrow operations, this is Daniel Mercer speaking. My name is Miranda Vale, I said, Transaction Authorization Officer for the Ashcroft Infrastructure Expansion, and I need to initiate a temporary administrative hold under the reputational governance clause tied to the Ashcroft escrow release. A pause, brief but weighted. Ms. Vale, he said carefully, are you certain you wish to trigger that provision? Yes, I said. I'm submitting a reputational incident report under clause 14.2. Supporting documentation will follow. The sound of typing filled the line, measured, deliberate. Then he spoke again. A provisional 72-hour administrative hold can be activated pending legal review. That will be sufficient. More typing. Notification will be automatically sent to the transaction's legal teams, the executive signatories, and registered board observers. That's correct. A final pause. The hold is now active. Thank you, Ms. Vale. I ended the call. For a moment, I stood still in the hallway, listening to the distant sound of the string quartet drifting through the doors. The laughter inside the ballroom was still warm, still easy, still completely unaware. Inside that room, $500 million had just stopped moving, and nobody knew it yet. I walked back through the doors and returned to the table. I picked up my glass. I stood where I had been standing before, in the same position, with the same quiet posture. Nothing about my expression had changed. About 40 seconds later, Daniel Ashcroft's phone vibrated against the table. He picked it up. He read the subject line, and the expression that moved across his face in that moment, the slow tightening around the jaw, the slight narrowing of the eyes, was the expression of a man who understood immediately that something had gone wrong, but not yet how wrong. Yet the subject line read, escrow release suspended. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted in the way that only people close to large financial transactions notice. The music was still playing. Champagne still moved between tables. But conversations had begun to slow, and across the room phones were quietly appearing on linen tablecloths. Daniel stood beside the investor table, staring at the notification in his hand. Next to him, Jasper Wren, the company's general counsel, a man I had spoken with twice during the documentation phase and who had spent 20 years learning to appear calmer than he felt, leaned over and studied the screen. His eyebrows lifted just slightly. It's probably procedural, he said quietly. Escrow systems sometimes trigger temporary holds when documentation updates are filed. Daniel did not look convinced. And around them, the notification had already reached the legal teams of several investors. A gray-haired partner from Housen Capital set his champagne down and leaned forward across the table. Daniel, he said carefully, his voice still controlled, but unmistakably serious. Why is escrow frozen? Across the table, another investor looked up from his phone. I'm seeing the same notice. Daniel exhaled slowly. We're checking. It's likely nothing. Behind them, Vivian still held her wine glass. She let out a dismissive laugh. This is ridiculous, she said, glancing around the table with the comfortable certainty of someone who had never once watched a deal collapse. You're all acting like the deal just fell apart. Her son was not laughing. Troy stood very still, scanning the room with visible irritation. Someone made a mistake, he said flatly. Fix it. The tension moved through the ballroom in quiet, spreading waves. Investors whispered to assistants. Legal advisors stepped closer to their clients. Phones appeared on tables that had held only glass stays minutes earlier. I walked back toward the bar. I set my glass exactly where it had been. I did not say anything. Then one of the investors looked up from his screen. His eyes moved slowly across the room until they settled on me. He spoke at a volume that carried clearly to several nearby tables. Daniel, there's a simpler question. He nodded in my direction. Who authorized the hold? The room went quiet. I didn't move. Then I answered, the transaction compliance signatory. I let the pause sit for one beat. That would be me. The silence that followed was the kind that spreads through a room when people realize something procedural has just become something serious. Not dramatic silence. Not the silence of a confrontation. The silence of recalculation. Daniel Ashcroft looked at me across the ballroom. The confusion on his face was giving way to something more careful. You authorized the hold? He asked. His voice was measured, not hostile. He was still trying to understand. Yes, I said. Several investors exchanged glances. Vivian Ashcroft let out a short, incredulous laugh. Oh, for heaven's sake, she said, waving one hand with the airy dismissiveness of someone who had clearly never once been held accountable in a professional setting. You cannot be serious. This entire evening is turning into theater. Troy stepped forward beside her. His voice had dropped, but the edge in it was sharp. You froze a $500 million escrow. Because of what exactly? Because of the reputational governance clause tied to the transaction, I replied. Jasper Wren's head lifted. Daniel frowned. That clause is for executive misconduct. Correct, I said. And it also applies to disclosed governance affiliates listed in the transaction filings. Several people at the investor table began opening their phones again. Vivian scoffed. I'm not part of the company's governance. I met her gaze. Yes, I said calmly. You are. A faint ripple of uncertainty moved through the room. In the disclosure documents submitted to Dominion Trust, I continued, you are listed as a governance affiliate of the CEO. Now that places your conduct within the reputational scope of the deal. Jasper was already pulling up the transaction agreement on his tablet. He scrolled in silence, page after page. The room grew quieter as he read. Investors watched him with the particular focused patience of people whose careers had trained them to wait for lawyers to finish reading before drawing any conclusions. Then Jasper's fingers stopped moving. He leaned closer to the screen. Section 14.2, he murmured. The clause was short. Its meaning was not. For several seconds, he said nothing. The ballroom had gone completely still. Then Jasper lifted his head and looked directly at Daniel. His voice dropped to just above a whisper. She's right. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. This one carried weight. Daniel ran a hand across his jaw. Across the room, Troy Ashcroft's face had darkened into the particular kind of anger that belongs to people who have never once been told that the rules apply to them too. He stepped forward. This is extortion. His voice cut through the room. A few heads turned immediately. He was pointing at me, and the certainty in his voice was the certainty of someone who was used to that kind of accusation-ending conversations. You embarrass my mother, he said, and suddenly the escrow gets frozen. That's not corporate governance. That's a threat. Don't play games, he added when I didn't respond. If you think you can hold this company hostage because someone hurt your feelings, you are going to regret it. He took one step closer. I can make one phone call tomorrow and make sure you never work in this industry again. The words landed into the room like a stone. Across the table, Jasper Wren closed the document on his tablet slowly. Daniel shifted beside him. Troy, he said quietly, this isn't helping. But the damage had already moved past the point of retrieval. Near the far end of the investor table sat a woman I had noticed when I first entered the ballroom, but had not yet been introduced to. Her name was Céline Maher. She represented Houchen Capital and chaired the investment committee overseeing the entire expansion. She was in her late 50s, composed, and had said almost nothing during the entire exchange. She simply watched. And from time to time, with no visible emotion, as she wrote a few short lines in a slim leather notebook resting beside her champagne glass, When people like Celine Maher started taking notes at moments like this, decisions were already forming somewhere behind the scenes. One of the senior partners leaned toward his colleague and spoke in a voice that was not quite quiet enough. Daniel, he said, glancing toward Troy, is this how the company is run? The ballroom never recovered the rhythm it had held earlier that evening. Conversations continued, but they were quieter now, more guarded, more careful. Investors had shifted from celebration to evaluation. The distance between those two things, in a room built on trust, was significant. At the far end of the table, Celine closed her notebook. Then she opened her tablet and began typing. At her, a secure file moved through the internal distribution channel used by Hauschen Capital's investment committee within seconds of her sending it. My phone vibrated softly. A document had arrived. The subject line read, Ashcroft Infrastructure, Governance Risk Review. I opened it. Inside were several short summaries pulled from internal governance filings and prior investor risk disclosures. Two of them immediately stood out. The first described an incident 2 years earlier at a charity auction where a junior staff member had filed a formal complaint after being publicly humiliated in front of donors. The matter had been resolved through a private HR settlement. No public consequences, no announcement. The second involved a private investor reception the previous year. According to the report, Vivian Ashcroft had confronted a visiting partner over a seating arrangement and demanded that event staff physically remove him from a restricted area. Again, contained quietly. No record in the public filings. No mention in the press. Seeing the two incidents side by side clarified something that a single event never could have. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was a pattern. Across the room, Vivian still looked irritated rather than worried. She had no idea that the information now circulating among the people who controlled the investment had just added two prior incidents to the one they had all witnessed tonight. I looked up from the screen. Selena Marr had risen from her chair. She was speaking quietly with one of the senior investors. Daniel was watching them with the growing unease of a man beginning to understand that the problem was no longer procedural. Celine turned back toward the table. Her voice was calm, but the words that followed landed with the precision of a document entering the public record. This, she said, wasn't the first warning. The calls began less than 10 minutes after Celine's file circulated. They did not come from journalists. They came from limited partners, the institution behind the $500 million. Several Hauschen Capital associates had stepped quietly into the side corridors, speaking in low voices into their phones. Their tone carried the calm restraint that precedes serious financial decisions. On the other end of those calls were pension fund managers, endowment officers, sovereign investment directors, the people who measured risk in basis points and who rarely moved quickly, but who, when they did move, moved with finality. One analyst standing near Celine relayed a fragment of the call quietly after it ended. They're asking about governance stability, he said, and whether family members are influencing operational decisions. That question alone was enough to shift the temperature in the room, because if the answer was yes, and the evidence now circulating suggested that it was, the implication reached far beyond one evening at a hotel ballroom. Governance risk meant pricing risk. It meant the models behind the investment needed to be recalculated. Risk premiums would rise, debt terms would tighten. A deal that had looked comfortably funded an hour earlier could suddenly become significantly more expensive, or significantly less viable. Daniel Ashcroft had begun pacing near the table. I could hear fragments of his conversation with Jasper. "This is a misunderstanding," Daniel said. "We'll resolve it." Jasper answered him in a low voice that was careful and precise. "The issue isn't the misunderstanding, it's the documentation." Across the room, Hushin's investment team had gathered at a side table, laptops open, phones on speaker. They were no longer discussing the gala. They were holding an emergency committee review. Celine ended one call and looked down briefly at her notes. Then she raised the phone again. On the other end, one of the limited partners spoke. His voice carried through clearly enough for several people nearby to catch the final sentence. We may have backed the wrong company." The emergency board meeting convened that same night in a private conference room on the floor above the ballroom. It was not scheduled and it was not announced. But within an hour of the investor calls beginning, The senior leadership of Ashcroft Infrastructure had assembled around a long conference table while their investors remained downstairs, conducting the kind of quiet, cautious conversations that precede formal decisions. A large screen at the end of the table showed a video call. The woman on it was Octavia Sloan, chair of the board's governance committee and one of the company's earliest institutional investors. She was in her early 70s and had the particular quality of authority that does not announce itself because it does not need to. The people rarely heard her raise her voice in these settings. They did not need to. Her influence moved through the room the moment she spoke. I have reviewed the initial report, Octavia said evenly. Before we discuss the escrow hold, I want a simpler question answered. Her eyes settled on Daniel across the screen. Who actually runs this company? No one answered immediately. Daniel shifted in his chair. I do, he said. Octavia did not respond. Instead, she turned to Jasper. Jasper slid a document to the center of the table. The audit trail from the past 12 months shows multiple instances where operational decisions were altered following direct involvement from members of the Ashcroft family, including non-executive individuals. The language was careful. The meaning was not. Celine added quietly from her seat. Yet our internal review reached the same conclusion. She opened a folder and placed several pages beside Jasper's report. Multiple operational approvals were modified following external pressure from family members. Vivian, who had insisted on attending the meeting, stiffened in her chair. Daniel leaned forward. These were informal discussions, nothing that affected core governance. Celine met his eyes. Our analysis suggests otherwise. The room went very still. Outside the glass wall, the city glittered faintly against a dark sky, the river below reflecting the light of the towers. The weight in the room was not theatrical. It was the quiet, specific weight of consequences assembling themselves. Octavia closed the file. Her voice remained quiet. The authority behind it was unmistakable. Like that ends today. Then she glanced around the table. Vote? The process that followed was methodical and swift in the way the governance actions become when the documentation is already complete. Daniel Ashcroft looked at me across the conference table. His expression had moved past frustration into something more resigned. What exactly would resolve the hold? He asked. The question was measured, but the strain beneath it was visible. I'm not asking for money, I said. Several heads lifted. That had clearly been the assumption, that I had triggered the hold as leverage for a concession, a renegotiated fee, a revised structure. It was a reasonable assumption for people accustomed to large deals stalling for financial reasons. This isn't about compensation, I continued. Yeah, it's about governance risk. I let the words settle before going on. If this transaction is going to proceed, the investors need to know the company is being run by professionals. That means 3 conditions. The room went still. First, I said, the CEO position must transition to independent leadership. Daniel didn't react immediately. The implication didn't need elaboration. Second, I continued, Vivian Ashcroft must be formally removed from all governance disclosures and barred from participating in company events tied to investors. Vivian's voice came sharp and immediate. You froze $500 million because of a comment. I looked at her for a moment before I answered. No, I said. I froze it because of a pattern. The room was very still. And third, I finished, turning back to Daniel. Troy Ashcroft must have no operational involvement with the company going forward, no advisory position, no access to internal meetings, nothing. No one spoke. Across the table, Celine watched the board members on the screen. Daniel leaned back slowly. That's not a negotiation, he said. No, I replied, it's a governance correction. Octavia studied the room. Her eyes moved from Daniel to Vivian, then to the documents lying open on the table. Then she folded her hands together. Vote, she said again. The motion passed. 2 weeks later, the headlines used the careful, restrained language that corporate journalists prefer when something embarrassing happens to a prominent company. Leadership transition announced at Ashcroft Infrastructure. Inside the industry, everyone understood exactly what that meant. Daniel Ashcroft had resigned as CEO. The board described it as a governance restructuring intended to restore investor confidence. An interim executive appointed by the board had taken operational control while a permanent replacement was identified. The rest of the changes followed in rapid succession. A formal governance resolution removed Vivian Ashcroft from all corporate disclosures. tied to investor relations and prohibited her from attending company-sponsored financial events. A separate filing, circulating quietly in legal circles within days of the incident, described a complaint for defamation and reputational harm connected to the events at the Harrington Grand. The complaint did not generate significant press coverage. It did not need to. The financial consequences had already spoken more clearly than any headline could. As the board issued a new internal policy, referred to informally within the company as the family governance ban, no relatives of any executive could participate in corporate functions involving investors or negotiations, not as guests, not as attendees, not in any capacity. As for Troy Ashcroft, the resolution was simple and absolute. No operational role, no advisory title, no access to internal meetings, no presence at company events. Nothing. During the week following the incident, the company's stock dropped nearly 12% as analysts began publicly questioning its governance culture. Several institutions issued formal statements indicating they were reviewing their positions. The $500 million deal did not disappear entirely. It was restructured under the new leadership team, yet with revised governance safeguards written directly into the binding agreement. Investors were cautious, they took their time. But eventually, carefully, the money began moving again. 1 year later, I was sitting at a corner table in a small restaurant in Midtown when my phone buzzed with a message from Celine Marr. She was calling to let me know that the restructured Ashcroft deal had closed successfully and that the new leadership team had received a strong governance rating from the independent auditors. She wanted me to know because, she said, the right decision had been made in that ballroom. Not the easy one. The right one. I set the phone face down on the table and looked out the window. The city moved the way it always does: taxis, foot traffic, the distant sound of a delivery truck somewhere down the block. Yet the white lilies in the window box of the restaurant across the street had just started to open. The thing about power is that most people confuse it with noise, with volume, with spectacle, with the ability to embarrass someone in a room full of witnesses and walk away laughing. But real power, the kind that holds, is quiet. It lives in documentation, in Clause 14.2, in the careful work done before anyone arrives at the table, in the knowledge that when the moment comes, you don't have to raise your voice. You just have to be prepared. Vivian Ashcroft had looked at me across that ballroom and decided in 3 seconds that I didn't belong in the room. She was wrong about who I was. But she was also wrong about something more fundamental. She assumed that her position gave her the right to define other people's worth out loud, in public, as without consequence. And the truth, and as the quiet, final, entirely legal truth, is that no position gives anyone that right. Success doesn't suspend the rules, influence doesn't dissolve accountability, and arrogance, left uncorrected long enough, eventually meets the one thing it cannot charm, intimidate, or dismiss: a system that was built to catch exactly this. I had exactly 30 seconds in that hallway to decide whether to let it pass. I chose not to, and I would make that same choice again. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of the simple conviction that everyone in that room deserved to be in it on equal terms. That's not a legal argument. It's not a corporate policy. It's just the truth, and sometimes the truth is the most powerful document in the room.